This pistol is over 100 years old. It fought in the trenches of the First World War. It crossed the beaches of Normandy. It killed men in Korean rice paddies, Vietnamese jungles, Iraqi streets, and Afghan mountains. And yet, certain units refused to let it go for decades after it was officially supposed to be gone. When you find out what those units have in common, what kind of fighting they do, and what happened on a beach in the Pacific that proved once and for all what this pistol could do that nothing else could, you'll understand why a design that old outlasted everything the modern world threw at it. This is the real story of the M1911. Not the one you've heard 100 times. The one that explains why it never left. To understand why the M1911 exists at all, you have to go back to the Philippines in the early 1900s. And you have to understand just how badly the United States Army was losing a fight it had no idea was coming. The Philippine-American War had officially ended in 1902, but in the southern islands, the Moro people, fierce Muslim warriors who had been fighting foreign armies for centuries, had not gotten the message. Or rather, they had. They just didn't care. American soldiers were patrolling through dense jungle, carrying the standard-issue .38 long Colt revolver, and it was getting them killed in a way that nobody had anticipated. Not because it jammed, not because it was inaccurate, because it lacked the power to stop a man who had decided he was going to die. The Moros had a practice called juramentado. A warrior would make a formal religious vow to die killing as many enemies as possible, work himself into a state of frenzy, and then charge, alone, into a group of armed soldiers carrying nothing but a bladed weapon called a kris. What made this terrifying wasn't just the courage, though that was real enough. It was that American soldiers were putting .38 caliber rounds into these men, and they were not going down. A juramentado warrior with 3 bullets in him would cover the remaining 10 feet and put that blade into a man before his body understood it was supposed to stop. One documented account from a U.S. Army officer describes a soldier emptying his 6-shot revolver into a charging Moro warrior at close range. 6 rounds. The man kept coming. The soldier survived only because a comrade stepped in with a rifle butt at the last second. It happened again and again. The Army launched a formal investigation. Field commanders sent urgent reports. The conclusion was simple and brutal. The .38 long Colt lacked the stopping power to stop a determined attacker before he closed the distance. And men were dying because of it. The Army's response was to temporarily reissue the old .45 caliber single-action Army revolvers from the Civil War era. 40-year-old guns. Because the bigger round worked and the newer gun didn't. That was the problem on the table, and eventually it landed on the desk of the one man in America best qualified to solve it. John Browning. The brief was as clear as it was demanding. Design a new semi-automatic service pistol chambered in at least .45 caliber, enough to stop a man immediately, not after he's had 4 seconds to put a blade into your throat. It had to function in mud, sand, salt water, tropical heat, and Arctic cold. Simple enough for a soldier with minimal training to operate under stress, and reliable enough that a man could bet his life on it. Because that is exactly what he would be doing. Browning had already designed some of the most successful repeating rifles and shotguns in America, and a series of machine guns that were rewriting the rules of warfare. He understood mechanical problems the way most people understand breathing, intuitively, completely, without effort. He took the brief and handed back the future. In 1910 and 1911, the Army ran what remains one of the most demanding weapons tests in military history. Multiple designs competed, but it came down to 2 serious contenders: the Colt, carrying Browning's design, and the Savage. The protocol was systematic and unforgiving. Each pistol would fire 6,000 rounds. There would be a brief pause every 100 rounds to allow cooling, but if a pistol became too hot to handle, it would be submerged in water and then fired again immediately without any additional drying or preparation. The guns were coated in mud, exposed to rust conditions, and subjected to deliberate abuse that went well beyond normal field conditions. Parts were swapped between damaged and working pistols to test whether components were interchangeable, a critical consideration for field repair. The savage accumulated stoppages and broken parts as the round count climbed. Jams, misfires, the kind of accumulated problems that add up to dead soldiers in a real fight. The Colt ran through clean. The official Army report was unambiguous. The Board of Officers recommended immediate adoption. In 1911, it became the standard issue sidearm of the United States Armed Forces. The model of 1911, the M1911. It would go to war within 3 years. American soldiers carried it into the trenches of France in 1917 and 1918. Officers carried it in the Pacific. NCOs carried it in Korea. Every branch of the American military carried it for 74 years without serious challenge. But none of that is the reason it refused to die. For that, you have to jump forward to a beach called Saipan in the summer of 1944. It is 4:45 in the morning on July 7th, 1944. The battle for Saipan has been grinding on for 3 weeks. American forces have pushed the Japanese defenders to the northern tip of the island. The Japanese commander, General Yoshitsugu Saito, is dead by his own hand. His forces are shattered, out of food, out of medical supplies, nearly out of ammunition. What happened next was not a military tactic in any conventional sense. It was something older and more desperate than that. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers launched what would become the largest Banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. And these were not fresh troops with full kit. Many were wounded. Some were carrying their dead comrades' rifles because they had already expended all ammunition for their own weapons. Some were armed with nothing but sharpened bamboo poles. They came screaming out of the darkness, waving flags and regimental banners in a mass wave that simply did not stop. They overran the first American defensive line. They kept running. They hit the second line and broke through that too. They were flooding through a gap more than a mile wide, pouring toward the rear, toward artillery positions, toward field hospitals and supply dumps and communication centers. And here is where the M1911 earned something that no technical specification, no test result, no endorsement from any general could ever provide. The soldiers holding the rear were not infantrymen. They were cooks, clerks, artillery crews, medical orderlies, men whose job was to support the fighters, not be the fighters. They had no prepared defensive position. They had no warning. They had a few seconds and whatever was on their body. For most of them, that meant the M1911 on their hip. What followed was close quarters fighting in the dark on a scale that has few parallels in American military history. Men firing their pistols until the magazines ran dry, reloading by feel, firing again. The .45 ACP cartridge, the same caliber that the Army had demanded after the Philippines, the same round that had been chosen specifically because it stopped men immediately, did exactly what it was designed to do. Survivors' accounts describe the chaos in vivid terms. Officers firing their pistols into the mass at arm's length. Soldiers using the pistol grip as a club when the slide locked back empty. Men standing their ground because there was nowhere to go and nothing else to do. The line held. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers died in that charge. American casualties were severe. But the position was not lost, and the medical units and artillery behind them were not overrun. In that kind of fight, dark, crowded, no warning, no distance, handguns mattered in a way they rarely do. And the men who survived it remembered what worked when the distance was measured in feet. That memory didn't leave the institutional culture of the units that were there. It became the foundation of an argument that would keep the M1911 in service for decades after it was officially supposed to be gone. After the war, the M1911 was so embedded in American military culture that replacing it seemed almost heretical. But that wasn't why it survived. It survived because of what it was. Browning did something unusual when he designed the M1911. He engineered the pistol and the cartridge simultaneously, as a single integrated system. Every dimension of the pistol was optimized specifically for the .45 ACP round he was also creating. The operating system is a short-recoil tilting barrel design. When the gun fires, the barrel and slide travel rearward together for a short distance, fully locked. The barrel then cams downward at the rear, unlocking from the slide. The slide continues back, extracting and ejecting the spent case, compressing the recoil spring. The spring drives the slide forward, stripping the next round from the magazine, chambering it. The barrel cams back up into battery. The gun is ready to fire. This sounds straightforward, but the tolerances Browning built into this system and the geometry of how the parts interact under firing stress resulted in a mechanism of extraordinary reliability. The cartridge itself is the other half of the argument. The .45 ACP is wide, 11.5 millimeters across, and relatively slow, leaving the barrel at around 830 feet per second compared to roughly 1,200 feet per second for a standard 9mm. What it lacks in velocity, it compensates in mass and frontal area. It's heavier, wider, and at close range, especially with modern expanding ammunition, it delivers a larger crush diameter through the target. The debate over exactly how much that matters has never fully been settled, and it probably never will be, but in the community of people for whom that question is not theoretical, the answer was always the same. In practical terms, the round hits like a hammer. The 9mm hits like a nail. Both penetrate. But in the specific scenario the M1911 was designed for, one attacker, very close range, no room to miss, no time for a second shot, the physics of the .45 ACP have a meaningful edge. When the Army replaced the M1911 with the Beretta M9 in 1985, the decision was driven primarily by logistics and standardization. NATO partners used 9mm. The M9 held 15 rounds versus 7. The M1911 was 74 years old, and the procurement system had moved on. The soldiers who used their pistols professionally noticed the difference almost immediately. Not the soldiers who carried a pistol as backup and hoped never to use it. The ones for whom the pistol was a primary tool. Special operations, close quarters specialists, the people who write after-action reports about what happened when the fight was over in 3 seconds and there was no time to think. In 1985, the M1911 was officially retired from General United States military service. 40 million pistols worth of institutional history set aside. It didn't matter. Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance units kept theirs. Delta Force and FBI Hostage Rescue, the unit that responds to the most dangerous domestic incidents in the country, reportedly held onto theirs as well. Special operations units across multiple branches quietly maintained stocks of M1911 variants and continued qualifying on them. And in 2012, MARSOC, the Marine Raiders, SOCOM's Marine component for special operations, formally reissued a modernized M1911 variant as their standard sidearm. Not as a historical tribute, not as an optional alternative, as the issued pistol for operators deploying to active combat zones. They called it the M45A1. Each of these units arrived at the same conclusion independently. In the specific type of combat they conduct, close quarters direct action, hostage rescue, room clearing, ambushes measured in seconds and feet, the .45 ACPM 1911 platform outperformed the alternatives in the metric that mattered most. Not round count, not weight, not ergonomics score on a procurement form. Terminal performance at bad breath distance. The modern variants barely look like their grandfather. Railed frames for weapon lights and lasers, skeletonized triggers, adjustable night sights, improved feed ramps that cycle modern hollow-point ammunition flawlessly, something early M1911s couldn't do reliably with anything other than ball. Ambidextrous controls, custom grip textures, hand-fitted to individual operators. The external silhouette is the same one Browning drew. Inside, 110 years of refinement has made the mechanism tighter and more consistent than anything he could have built by hand. The Army is now transitioning the broader force to the Sig Sauer P320, a modern, striker-fired pistol chambered in 9mm with much improved ammunition that partly closes the terminal performance gap. The M1911's run in general service is over. But general service was never the point. The weapons that endure are not always the newest or the most sophisticated. They're the ones built around a real problem, a life-or-death engineering problem, and solved so completely that every attempt to improve on them ends up compromising something the original got exactly right. John Browning looked at what was happening in the Philippines in the early 1900s and asked one question. What does a man need when another man is trying to kill him from 3 feet away, and every fraction of a second is the difference between going home and not? He answered it with a piece of steel and a brass cartridge. He got it so right that it's still holstered on the hip of American operators, going through doors and places most people will never hear about, fighting wars he couldn't have imagined, more than a century after he sat down to solve the problem. That is not nostalgia. That is not institutional inertia. That is not tradition for its own sake. That is what it looks like when someone gets it right the first time. If you made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't do surface level. Every video we make goes this deep. The engineering, the battlefield, the reason things worked or didn't. If that's what you're here for, subscribe. There's a lot more coming.